I didn't have that. The red button was pressed instead of the green button. But this is Philosophy for the People with Stefan Bertram, and I'm saying it again, and we are talking about the culture, the Utopian sci-fi series. Great, these microphones. You need to have them green, not red. Great start. Great start, and we're doing something different today. Usually, every week, I make a big PowerPoint, and we go through that, and that provides a lot of structure that's really necessary when you're speaking alone. But today, I mean, that's a lot of effort, basically. It consumes quite a lot of my week to do that. So today, we're going to try something else. Today, I have like a 500-word introductory statement, which I'm just going to read out to you. And then we're going to go through a series of interviews and articles about the culture. And I'm going to comment and pontificate and discuss these articles. So I'm going to put this on screen. Is that readable? I think it will be, because it is readable in small form, even for me. But hopefully that's readable for everyone. And I will read my opening statement. The culture is very much distinct from similar sci-fi series, with the tone suggesting to me that it is the inheritor of Soviet sci-fi, while an article we will discuss later suggests that the culture focuses on what cultural developments will follow along from technical innovations. While Banks, the author, does not make open reference to Marx in his works, the works are in some sense naturally Marxist. The culture is a communist society, in the sense that Marx outlined, where there's more than enough for everyone, such that there's no need to work for survival or to work at all in the sense that we understand it today, and labor is instead turned to play and to hobby. Things are not bought and not sold, and so on. The end result is a society which resembles the utopias imagined by left anarchists. Banks imagines this coming about not because of certain concrete traditions, such as the nature of Banks does imagine this coming about because of certain concrete conditions, such as the nature of life in the void, as in what are the kind of material circumstances that will occur when humans live on space stations, and what kind of material culture will this imbue. Though he stumbles in various other ways, such as thinking it may be impossible for humans to achieve the sort of culture that is in the culture, due to our genetic flaws of greed and things like this. That Banks imagines communism coming about in the future, and then seriously explores what this society would look like, may seem kind of basic. But this is largely something which is ignored in most of the sci-fi. The primary mode of science fiction is to have either contemporary or reactionary social structures alongside far future technology. Star Trek may be in some sense broadly communistic, or at least socialist, but its political system is still broadly Western democratic. Sci-fi stories are engaged in different things, and a story like Dune, which is not about imagining the future, can do perfectly well with a reactionary social order. Realism for realism's sake, of course, is only one of many paths, and the culture does not try to be realistic on all paths either. There's very little interest in working out the reality of material sciences beyond what makes for a good story. In this sense, the culture does hard sociology without doing hard physics. The culture is also notable for portraying a good culture at the height of its glory, a culture for which the author takes the only problem to be their smugness. I would take their lack of crusading spirit to be a far worse one, but the culture is also highly interventionist compared to other good sci-fi cultures, such as the Star Trek Federation, which are often consumed by a sort of pluralistic liberalism, where they're like, oh, it's just as good to be a savage than it is to live in lovely utopian communism. While Banks toyed with the idea of showing the decline and destruction of the culture, he never did. I think that's for the best. That the culture is communist, and thus at least internally post-historic, does mean that none of Banks' stories feature the inside of the culture in any great detail, because all things worth writing genre fiction about only happen in simulations or outside of the culture. It is a small minority of people in the culture that deal with the poor, benighted members of the galaxy outside of the culture That is the main concern of the texts, contact, as they're called, among other things that we will discuss today. What are you reading? Asks Zizek in Spanish. And then he did a confused face, and then he said, censorship is not left-wing, and then he left, apparently. So I'm not sure what was going on in that angle, but since he has apparently said goodbye, I will not bothering to answer his question. So the first interview is an interview with Banks, which is, it's also an interesting one because if you go on this website, I've had to use Web Archive here, and I won't show you the website it does go to if you don't use Web Archive, because this page, this website has now been taken over by a crypto gambling website. There's a crypto gambling website, crypto casino gambling, which has taken over this website that used to do literary fiction interviews. But it's very interesting because deep inside the structure of this now crypto gambling website still remains this lovely interview with Iain Banks. Banks first kind of gives in this interview an account of how the culture works as his utopia. He says it is my utopia, my personal image of exactly the place I would like to live. I cannot imagine a better place. There's no way I can think of what to make the culture better resemble my own personal idea for a utopian society. I'm very aware that being the case, it could get terribly boring if all I do is drone on about what a totally wonderful place the culture is. And I think this is really deeply rare in terms of the fiction that authors write about. I would never dare write about a culture which is exactly kind of my utopia. Because I think, as we say, that the problem is then surely it's boring, because as an author, what do you write about your perfect culture apart from kind of just self-indulgence? Though maybe when Banks was writing, this wasn't really much of a thing, but there now is this sort of fiction called cozy fiction, which does kind of go around people's quite mundane lives without much happening. But I think still, even in the case of this, like coffee shop cozy fantasy or anything like this, the drama still revolves around the fact that, like, oh, we have to keep the cafe open. And so there aren't no stakes, rather there's low stakes. And lots of those stakes revolve around kind of capitalist or feudalistic economies. And so still, even within such a beautiful place as a culture, these things couldn't exist. Yeah, I think he kind of bookends the culture one way or another, but he doesn't actually get rid of it. He goes on. If you're writing from the point of view of someone who doesn't believe the same way you do, it makes you think, you start to question your own beliefs, and there's always a progressive good thing to do. And Banks tries to emphasize this within the works of the culture by trying to bend over backwards to look at the underside of the culture. Having said that, the culture does its damnedest to accommodate everyone, even people who hate it. It expends vast amount of time and resources to make sure everyone can live exactly as they want. There's nothing about it to hate apart from its own smugness. I know it's smug. That's a price of perfection, I'm afraid. I think this is an interesting part about how we might imagine utopia. That expands a vast amount of time and resources, making sure everyone can live exactly as they want. I think if we might imagine a different kind of utopia, a more common one, the point is less about expanding vast resources to make sure everyone is accommodated, but changing what people want. The idea of a new Soviet man and so on. And of course, this exists within limits. We aren't kind of, well, I was going to say we aren't Pol Potists, but then actually Pol Pot also was kind of trying to remake the society. not really remaking the men inside it, but first remaking their material circumstances such that it would change them. But the culture doesn't seem to be interested in that. Instead, it seems to expend its vast resources not to make people in a certain way, but to have a facility, have the possibility of having a widespread culture that can accommodate everyone in every way. We've already mentioned contact. It is fantastic how much he likes the culture. He says, I'd have a great time in the culture. I would want to be in contact. That's the ambition of choice in the culture. Contact is the most interesting bit, and joining it is the only ambition it's possible to hold in the culture. That's culturally acceptable to hold in the culture, which is interesting to do with that, because he does say that, what I've discussed already, but actually spends a lot of time going on about how a lot of cultural kind of aspirations that we find very normal, especially around ambition, are impossible in the culture. But that doesn't mean normally excluding these people. It normally means pushing them off into a simulation. Contact is a culture's saving grace, and I think this is kind of one of the most fundamental bits of it. I think of the culture as some incredibly rich lady of leisure who does good charitable works. She spends a lot of time shopping and getting her hair done, but she goes out and visits the poor people and takes some baskets of vegetables. Contact does that on a larger scale. And now we might be very, very adverse to this kind of analogy as proper hardcore leftists, but he does make clear in a later quote, I'm not sure if I included it in this or it was somewhere else, that the difference between contact and the culture and this kind of rich old lady is that there's no relationship of exploitation. The culture is not incredibly wealthy because they exploit other parts of the galaxy. They don't have exploitative relationships in his accounting with anyone, and that's a plausible enough account. But still, even saying that, there's a lot to be very critical of here in terms of, is that really what a communist society will look like in relation to the rest of the galaxy? So contact is a very small part of the culture, and they do expend like a very small minority of the culture's resources in helping the rest of the galaxy. But it seems that the culture would be doing something much better if they were instead like a revolutionary vanguardist culture, who had a much tighter concept of what is acceptable, and instead of spending all their resources on making sure the weird people in their society were accommodated, if these people were instead just forced to go along with things, and then most of the resources of the culture, or at least a lot of them, were expended on making sure the rest of the galaxy was communistic, that would be a much better thing generally, and also would ensure a much safer future for the culture. 255 AD says, something that bothers me about the idea of the culture and special circumstances is they have a high level of certainty about the consequences of their interventions that can never be possible in real life. Yeah, this is something which is also interesting, which he brings up at least once in these interviews, which is the culture is unwilling to intervene in something unless they are like mathematically certain that it's morally the right thing, which also requires like a mathematization of morality. But also, as 255 AD points out, it also requires a lot of information that might be implausible that any organization, no matter how advanced, could be. Of course, it's a lot less implausible than, say, the amount of information that an Atreides has about the future and so on. He continues, sorry, not Iain Banks, the 255 AD in the comments. Like, even if some states in real life wanted to do interventions for purely benevolent reasons, they could never simulate it out the way the culture does to ensure perfect results. Though, of course, at least the culture has the excuse of having very mighty AI minds. Midi says, I suppose to get hold of the culture IP, I just imagine it'll be very, very hard to make a culture TV show. It's only a bloody book. Yes, but like, I don't know why people say this. Like, okay, yeah, it's just a book, and we're discussing it seriously. I think there's a confusion that goes on. I think I already discussed this also when we talked about 40K, where some people take culture seriously in the wrong way. They think that Dark Souls makes people fascist. Dark Souls doesn't make people fascist, but I'm going to talk about what structure is going on in in Dark Souls. I'm going to take that discussion absolutely seriously. So I don't think culture particularly causes things to go in society, but I do think cultural items reflect society and reflect how we go about thinking about things. And when we're discussing them, we should kind of do this absolutely seriously. Dark Souls is an RPG. It's a hack and slash kind of thing. But there was a big tweet on Twitter recently saying it makes people fascist. And obviously it was a tweet, so there was no evidence or reasoning behind this. It was just literally Dark Souls makes people fascist. Another very interesting part was the way the culture came about was initially, as I was, it came out to a solution to a particular problem. I was getting ready to write use of weapons, and I knew that Zalaki was the ultimate warrior guy, but very martially able. But I wanted him to be on the side of the good guys somehow. And this shows a lot about Iain Banks and how he thinks about things. Because obviously, for lots of authors, especially these days, having the ultimate warrior guy be on the side of the good guys is really easy. The only way it isn't is if you're so grimdark there aren't even clear goodies. But yes, so he thinks it's really quite difficult to have the ultimate warrior guy on the side of the good guys, which shows kind of how reluctant Iain Banks is to kind of martial warrior aspect stuff compared to the vast majority of authors within sci-fi fantasy. Squaring that circle was the problem, so I came up with the idea of the culture as his ultimate employers, a society based on this, basically on the side of angels, but willing to use people like Zalaki, with utopias spawning few warriors, to do its dirty work, but justified work. The justified bit always ends into statistics. This is what 258 AD was talking about. Having to do something with statistics, from the very beginning, the culture had to be able to prove, rather than simply assert, that it was genuinely doing the right thing, even when it interfered without permission in other societies. So another thing he thinks here is it's not just that another obstacle, I guess, that he thinks probably to the culture being a revolutionary vanguardist culture is that they doesn't really produce this sort of utopian society doesn't produce these kind of warriors. But that's kind of a strange idea because at the same time, he thinks that the most appealing thing in the culture, not just to him, but to anyone within the culture, is to join Contact. And of course, Contact aren't necessarily warriors, but they're a very highly advanced culture which comes on massive ships, which can, while it's not their main function, blow anyone out of the air or void or so on. And you don't need to be, and I guess that's the other point, it's why in a far future war do you need anything like we would understand to be a current warfighter, warrior, scary guy in order to fight? Yes, the Dark Souls is a video game. Plan suggests that the MCU makes people fascist. I don't think the MCU makes you do anything apart from just generally rots your brain a little bit. He details a bit more of kind of the communistic nature of the culture here. But only a very amateur level as we would understand it. And not just because there's no need or way to be a true professional in any field in a society without money. In the culture, you express yourself creatively because you enjoy and feel it to be personally fulfilling. You don't do it to prove how completely brilliant you are to your peers, potential sexual partners, and the world in general, because at the back of your mind, you know almost any mind could do it better. mind here is the name for the advanced sci-fi AI. And I think this is a point where I very decisively disagree with Banks. Banks thinks that we will only kind of engage in cultural production in the future for reasons of, you just kind of like to do it for the same reason that people like to do science, who like to do like write fan fiction and so on, and fan fiction which isn't even going to be popular and so on. They just do it for the sake of writing it itself. But I think I really, really fundamentally disagree with that. I think in a communistic society, of course, people are going to produce cultural objects for the sake of their ambition, to prove themselves and so on. But for me, there's no. What else would you be doing? I think this is kind of probably my most Nietzschean perspective, but I don't think it's something I find to be fundamentally absolutely true. Of course, we'll be producing, because once you're freed from the money object, that's exactly when you can do everything for your ambition. That's exactly when everyone becomes like the free range aristocrat that Nietzsche imagines, who can just do everything for the sake of their own pride. He makes the point as regarding AI with the idea that, well, why would anyone bother if they knew AI could do better? And I would say that, first off, we have weight classes. The idea of kind of mind classes in the future isn't exactly revolutionary. And I would say that, and we'll come back to this point later, I think, is that for me, I don't see, when I imagine the future, I think it's a mistake to imagine that there'll be, on one hand, AI, and on one hand, there'll be humans. I think there'll only be a combined class of post-humans on kind of a spectrum. Okay, there'll be some fully digital minds, but some fully digital minds will be largely instated on human lines, while there'll be embodied individuals who are entirely cyborgs, but all of them will be stamped. Like all AI that we ever make will be stamped with the human consciousness, with the human nature. I think it's there won't be these like stupid humans which are left behind by these immense minds. Rather, in combination, both humans and AI will develop together into becoming post-humans who are, much greater individuals than we have at present, but beyond kind of small nature reserves. I don't think these pure biological humans, which don't even have like brain implants or anything like this, will exist and go on. I did write a brief introduction to like the first section of a sci-fi series set in a communist world, and obviously those the post-humans in that just referred to themselves as humans, and referred to like us as pre-humans, and referred to kind of they didn't refer to themselves as being in a post-historical time. Rather, they referred to all times that happened before communism as being prehistoric. But that's kind of a thing of like, but can I not still climb for pride in that case? Do people not in that case still climb for pride? Like some people don't climb for pride, but I think pride and ambition are very much large reasons in why people do climb. Oops. I don't know if there's that much to discuss here, but I could just say this is also a great one where Iain Banks is completely right. The idea that you also said that being able to physically change the sex of your body is important to maintaining gender equality. I think that is the fundamental part when like these kind of differences or kind of systems of oppression and inequality will only disappear at the point where they become physically irrelevant. And the point that gender will become physically irrelevant, it becomes increasingly physically irrelevant with each year. Though, of course, at the same time, we're becoming more and more intensely culturally obsessed with it. But I don't think that's something which can hold. I don't think that is a structure which can maintain itself. I think it's something which will inherently, in the end, self-abolish. But the point is that I think the final frontier of this is when we can just change back and forth between certain sexual arrangements. And at that point, gender is truly abolished. Not abolished in the sense we're all kind of pretending we're turning our eyes away from it. At that point, it really is kind of fundamentally abolished and got rid of. You can see here that Iain Banks doesn't believe in socialist suburbia. It's high density urbanism combined with rural areas. This is something which is referred to later on too, that the main problem that Banks envisions in the culture is kind of ennui. That the culture doesn't produce, because it's kind of so pluralistic, it doesn't say have the culture of an alternative, we could imagine, vanguardist culture, which is driven by this very particular drive, which is the drive for galactic communism. The culture doesn't have the drive, particularly, not in a strong sense, not in an immediate sense, to globalize itself, or in this case, galaxize itself, to universalize itself. So instead, it's kind of, oh, like, well, things are very nice within us, but we don't have, that's not for any grand reason. We're kind of just doing it for its sake. We don't have a combined culture where there's certain things we all prohibit, but the difference between things you prohibit and things you love. And when your thing that you love most of all is kind of the freedom to do whatever, but everyone already can do whatever, it's not a particularly useful culture for driving people. Yes, you're correct. That he calls it explicitly hippie. He says that the culture is basically commie hippies. He gives the lady the man thing again, but he does make the point that I made. The culture is not, in his view, responsible for just destitution in the galaxy, which is true in a direct sense, but I would still say the culture is guilty for not trying to universalize its own economic system in any kind of forceful way. This is a series of notes that Banks made on the culture. And this is the one that blew my mind the most. I read all the culture books just thinking that the people in it were humans. Because there's absolutely no way you could tell they're aliens. There's no detail, I think, which makes clear that they're aliens. I think they do at some point give the dates in the book as on the human calendar, and they're like wrong for being a human sci-fi culture. But then I just assumed that was something of humans being seeded beforehand. But no, apparently the culture is a sci-fi culture, is an alien culture. And Banks basically gives the explanation here that, well, he thinks there's a natural evolutionary tendency for humans to kind of appear in a certain way, for intelligent beings to appear in a certain way. And as much as I think that's deeply unconvincing, on the other hand, we return to the same point, which is not everything in a sci-fi culture should, even in a sci-fi novel series or other cultural item, should try even to be realistic. Well, it'd be quite interesting for one series to try to do everything realistically, but I don't think it's ever going to happen. And Banks isn't interested in kind of doing the weird body plan stuff, and so he doesn't, and that's it to it, basically. 255 AD points out there is a culture novel where they visit Earth. I think they do like a weird kind of flyby. I can't remember the text itself, though it is mentioned somewhere in these articles. It's also interesting. I think this is necessary for there to be anything. Of course, if we go back to my point about the culture being vanguardist or not being vanguardist, another reason the culture is not vanguardist is to allow the plot. Because of course there would be plot while the culture is trying to universalize itself. But once it had universalized itself, then again the plot would end. And most decisively end, because there wouldn't even be anything to contact with. If they're aliens, can they be communist? Well, I mean, the classic Pododis, I've actually never tried to say it out loud, position is that if aliens do come to us, they would be communist. But I think the objection to that is if aliens are already communist and they don't have faster than light travel, why are they even coming over? I suppose been saying that, I'm contradicting myself a bit. What is also interesting about this is that Iain Banks thinks of these kind of advanced cultures. The culture is actually one of the more energetic ones. Compared to most cultures like this, he thinks they'll be even less active, even less intervening in the outside world, because they'll just have their nice, perfect sphere, and they'll be too materially advanced for anyone to fuck with. And I think the assumption is cultures that want to fuck with you are rather less advanced than you. And so, because they're like religious fanatics or whatever, they're not communists, and so they don't develop to a sufficient degree of material sophistication, you can beat them. And so there isn't much interest in having to like remain on a war footing, and you can't really be beaten by them. This is the material culture point that I made earlier on. The culture in its history and its ongoing form is an expression of the idea that the nature of space itself, as in not space as in like dimensionality, but space as in the void, as in the space between the stars, itself determines the type of civilization which will thrive there. Essentially, the contention is that our currently dominant power systems cannot survive long in space. Beyond a certain level of technology, a degree of anarchy is arguably inevitable and anyway certainly preferable. He discusses how in space breakaway movements will be much harder to control, and also notably, I don't think I include this part, but he discusses a great deal how the culture is mostly a spacer society. Most people in the culture, very few people in the culture, I think he says 1, 2, 3, 4, 5%, live on planets. 90% or more of the people in the culture live on spacecraft, they live on asteroids, they live on artificial constructs. The culture is not a society of planets. Banks does think that like the aliens that came about that made the culture were made in certain biological ways that humans may lack, such that we'll never do a similar thing. Yeah, I mean, this is the other point, which is it doesn't matter if you're winning in some kind of abstract race if you're producing something. But I guess his point would be that you can't produce for the sake of pride in those sort of circumstances. It's certainly not kind of not personal pride, but interpersonal pride, where of course you can produce your thing and it has an innate value because you produced it and because it's unique, or hopefully it's unique. I mean, you could have a slot machine which just produces endless amounts of every variation, but that just seems almost impossible, even for some kind of horribly advanced LLM using 1,000 stars of energy to just churn out a load of absolute shite. But the point is that, you know, once you get to the point of being like, well, obviously, I mean, my book isn't better than these other books, but I produced it, I made it. That's not a point of interpersonal pride. You're not trying to prove anything to anyone apart from maybe you can write a book, but you're not trying to prove that you've written the best book or the best of a certain genre or the best of a certain kind or whatever else. Yes, everything makes you fascist. Everyone, yeah, obviously, you just need to look at culture instead. Whenever it becomes a fascist, it's not because of like material culture or things becoming worse or anything like this. It's just whatever they're reading or looking at or watching. Can you migrate to the culture, or is it a gated anarchist community? I think I've included this later on, but the culture gets very little immigration, which is another interesting part. The theory here is that the property and social relations of long-term space dwelling, especially over generations, would be of a fundamentally different type compared to the normal planet. The mutuality of dependence in an environment which is inherently hostile would necessitate an internal social cohesion which would contrast with the external casualness typifying the relationship between such ships or habitats. Succinctly, socialism within, anarchy without. This broad result is, in the long term, independent of the initial social and economic conditions which give rise to it. This is kind of his most fundamentally Marxist point, that he thinks this kind of socialistic culture in space, regardless of the specificities of the culture, is inevitable because of kind of the vulnerability and necessity for total cooperation, as well as advanced material culture, which is present on something like a space station. Though he says also, what is vital for such a scheme, however, and what was always missing in the planned economies of our world's experience, is the continual, intimate, decisive participation of the mass of citizenry in determining these goals and designing as well as implementing the plans which should lead to them, which again is very much more possible once you have high advanced information culture to go along with your rest of your material culture. You can plan in this effective democratic way based on the correct information once you have very high information technology. It's a really fascinating concept. I think I need to break my vows of reading and have a crack at. If a podcast can make someone actually read a book, then I think that podcast can be deemed a success. Will there still be McDonald's in the culture? I think there will be McDonald's if someone wants to run a McDonald's and other people want to go to the McDonald's. I think that's the kind of fundamental flippy-dippy hippieism in the culture that Iain Banks is imagining. But, you know, it's something which isn't entirely horrible to think about. The culture, of course, has gone beyond even that, which is, to be clear, the culture does not have this sort of basic planned socialist economy. Rather, to an economy which is much a part of society, it's hardly worthy of a separate definition, and which is limited only by imagination, such as if you want a McDonald's. Can you imagine McDonald's? Philosophy and manners, and the idea of a minimally wasteful elegance, a kind of galactic ecological awareness allied to its desire to create beauty and goodness, whatever, in the end, practice, as ever, will outshine theory. This is how work works in culture. Nothing and nobody in the culture is exploited. It's essentially an automated civilization in its manufacturing process, with human labor restricted to something indistinguishable from play or a hobby. I dream. No machine is exploited either. The idea here being that any job can be automated in such a way as to ensure that it can be done either by a machine well below the level of potential consciousness, which to us would be a stunningly sophisticated computer running a factory, for example, would be locked upon by the culture's AI as a glorified calculator, and no more exploited than an insect is exploited when it pollinates a fruit tree the human eats a fruit from. Where intelligent supervision of a manufacturing or maintenance operation is acquired, the intellectual challenges involved would require such supervision, would make such supervision rewarding and enjoyable, whether for human or machine. The Christ decision of supervision required can be adjusted to a level which satisfies the demand for it arising from the nature of the civilization's members, which is to say, it seems, that the culture would happily kind of engage in like make work jobs. So, you need someone to run the sanitation. And it turns out, there's only really one guy that wants to do that. So you just let it run very minimally with limited supervisions. But as it turns out, still in the future of the culture, there are a lot of trained guys. There are a lot of trained guys. But hypothetically, you could have driverless trains. But if there were enough trained guys in a culture, and well, it depends. You might say, oh, you do that in simulation, mate. Or maybe you say, no, train guys, you can actually drive the trains, or you can actually maintain the trains, you can actually do this or that. People, and I'd argue this sort of conscious machine would happily cooperate with them. It's basically saying people and AIs hate to feel exploited, but they also hate to feel useless. One of the most important tasks in setting up and running a stable, internally coherent civilization is finding an acceptable balance between the desire for freedom of choice in one's actions and the freedom from mortal fear in one's life, and the defeat that even in a society so uncharacteristically utopian, one is still contributing something. I think that's kind of a point that he does discuss. So he does understand that the culture has a problem with meaning. And so it is important for people to be located in these certain ways. 255 AD says, the planning of the economy is largely theoretical option in the culture for the most part. They typically delegate that to minds in a sort of liquid democracy setup. Yeah, it's very much the case. That, that's kind of, I think he was discussing the democratic bit was an earlier stage of the culture, but yes, it's not like the economy is intensively planned, apart from maybe in places where people really want to intensively plan it, then it will be intensively planned. For the culture to continue without terminal decadence, the point needs to be made regularly that its easy hedonism is not some ground state of nature, but something desirable, fastidiously worked for in the past, not necessarily easily attained, and requiring its appreciation and maintenance both in its present and in the future. And this is the point where this is why the culture wants there to be, why people in the culture want to join contact, why people in the culture want to join special circumstances, because this sort of thing is emphasized to them. But this sort of thing could also be the embryonic push for a vanguardist culture, both because it emphasizes the importance to defend this sort of culture, but surely in knowing what you had to do to reach this kind of state, you would look upon the rest of the galaxy and think, surely we need to do a great amount to make sure that everyone is like us. Everyone has the same gifts that we have. Yeah, I said here that this is a bit of a basic point, but he makes his AI and his aliens very, very human in their desires and their thoughts and their wills and so on. And it's interesting because he thinks and emphasizes at various points that he thinks there's something very unusual about the culture, in the culture, that we might not be able to attain anything like it because of some genetic predisposition within us. But I think what he's actually describing again and again is a whole galaxy which is turned towards very particular human desires. And there's, of course, nothing wrong with that. I think that's what's something that's most interesting about the culture. But I think it's one way in which Iain Banks kind of gets his own writing wrong in some ways. to return to the AI point, and this is also a point where, we need to emphasize how the culture works as a literary work. One idea behind the cultures as depicted in the stories is that it's gone through the cyclic stages during which there's been extensive human-machine interfacing, and other stages, sometimes coinciding with human-machine areas, when extensive genetic alteration has been the norm. The era of these stories written so far, dating from 1300 AD to 2100 AD, is one in which the people of the culture have returned, probably temporarily, to something more classical in terms of relationships with machines and the potential of their own genes. So he does acknowledge that we should imagine that in the future, humans and machines will become at some point largely indistinguishable. But at the same time, he's making the literary choice to be like, sure, hold on, but in my culture, in my version, in the bit I'm writing about, I'm going to make life easy for myself and just make everyone a human. So lots of just stuff about this is just about the sex change, but I've already gone through that. This is one of the saddest bits. This is one of the most. This for me is the clearly most disappointing part of the whole culture series. Which brings us to the length of these generations and the fact that they can be said to exist at all. Humans in the culture normally live about 3.5 to 4 centuries. The majority of these lives consist of a 3-century plateau, which they reach in what we compare to our mid-20s after a relatively normal pace of maturation during childhood, adolescence, and early adulthood. They age very slowly during these 300 years, then begin to age more quickly, then they die. Philosophy, again, death is regarded as point of life, and nothing, including this universe, lasts forever. It's seen as bad manners to try and pretend that death is something not natural. Instead, death is seen as giving shape to life. None of this, of course, is compulsory. Nothing in the culture is compulsory. Some people choose biological immortality. Others have their personality transcribed into AIs and die happy, feeling they continue to exist elsewhere. Others, again, go to storage to be woken in more or less interesting times, or only every decade or century or aeon, over exponentially increasing intervals, only when it looks like something very, very different is happening. This is very, very sad for me. Iain Banks is pro-death, and I think it really reveals this kind of interesting part from pro-death humans, where it says, in my utopia, people live 3.5 to 4 centuries. And it's like, why that number? And it's that number because it's about 4 to 5 times what actual humans have. But if we were turtles, and we all did already live between 3.5 to 4 centuries, the turtle Iain Banks would imagine us as living between 12 and 15 centuries. Really, fundamentally, this reveals like a real limit. I think when any kind of, and of course, there's reasons for this often in sci-fi, but I feel like this is not necessary in his. There's plenty of reasons in sci-fi when you're talking about like hierarchical cultures for people not to be biologically immortal, which is to say, to do stuff like messy stuff around succession, to have that when a king dies, there aren't like a million other relatives. Of course, because you can solve things through murder, probably. Depends how biologically advanced you are. At some point, I think humans will be, or post-humans will be basically impossible to murder beyond kind of like engulfing them in a star. I lost my train of thought. There's various reasons to disallow biological immortality when you're writing a sci-fi story, because it can really limit your possibilities. You have people hanging around for ages and ages and ages, and there isn't really much justification. Like if you have a hierarchical society, having biological immortality is brutal, because you just have these people hanging around at the top forever. But that's not a problem the culture has. There isn't a need to make people die when you don't have this hierarchical culture, because people can just retire to their little planet, and the people we focus in the culture can just be the new ones. And of course, The AI don't live for 3.5 to 4 centuries, I think. I don't know. Someone can correct me. So yes, I think this is a really sad limit to imagination that Iain Banks is showing here. Which is like, oh, people live much longer, but then they eventually choose to die. And it's like, why? Why would they ever choose to die? Like, maybe because they're bored, but why would people become bored at the same rate? And so on and so forth. I think an important or a really important distinction between the Federation and the culture isn't meant to be our future. Yes, I mean, at least not directly. I think the culture is definitely meant to be aspirational in some ways, but not in a direct, straightforward sense. Not in a literal way. That obviously the Federation is literally meant to be the human future. Yes, and this is why anyone that's suspicious about trans stuff needs to defend trans stuff anyway, because only by defending trans stuff will they allow us to have robot arms. Yes, I think this is the other point where, maybe when you're 10 or you're 100, you think by 300 to 400, you might be bored of life. And actually, you get to 300, 400, and you're like, oh no, I need to live 3 centuries more. I'm sure there was a point where a very young Iain Banks was like, I can't imagine ever being 59. But then when Iain Banks was 59, he felt terribly, terribly rushed because he was dying, and he was dying having left so many things unread and unfinished and so on. Nuclear Glue asks, have you heard about 7076? Oh, 1776. As in one more, not the year of the Revolutionary War, but about 15,000 years after that. It's a web fiction thingy about a future where people solved all their problems and devoted their immortal lives to playing a bizarre variation of American football. No, I have not, but I'm going to screenshot your comment right now and later investigate that, because that sounds quite entertaining. I think I won't read it, but it's still very interesting. Yeah, we can imagine all the brain rot the culture would have. Like, they would have the most powerful brain rot ever. And because they're so biologically and kind of technologically advanced, you could literally just sit there and watch infinite brain rot for thousands of years, non-stop, without eating or sleeping or anything. Are you saying there is a Blood Bowl mod, or are you just joking? Because that would be cool if there's a Blood Bowl mod. Right, yeah, 255 AD says culture AI regularly live for thousands of years. So why are the humans doomed to death for 300 to 400? Okay. Yeah, and it's like, if June is willing to make people live for 3,000 years, I mean, the thing is, this is worse than 40k actually. There's various people in 40k who have lived for 10,000 years, and the figure given here of 300 to 400 years is like the biological limit for space marine, and 40k is meant to be a horrible, horrible dystopia. And obviously, it is for most of the humans in it, and have an average lifespan of about 40. But I will stop whining about Iain Banks being a deathist, and I'll move on to something else. Does he have any of the names here? No. But I will read this bit regardless. The culture's largest vessels are the general system vehicles of the contact section. Contact is part of the concerned with discovering, cataloging, investigating, evaluating, and if thought prudent, interacting with other civilizations. Its rationale and activity are covered elsewhere in the stories. The GSVs are fast and very large craft, measuring in kilometers, inhabited by millions of people and machines. The idea behind them is they represent the culture fully. All that the culture knows, each GSV knows. Anything that can be done anywhere in the culture can be done within or by any GSV. In terms of both information and technology, they represent a last resort and act like a holographic fragment of the culture itself, a whole container within each part. Yes. The other is I think you call them dragon lovers or something like this, because there's a short piece of fiction which maybe I could just dramatically read one day, an anti-death item, where there's basically a discussion of the stories where there's this like horrible dragon which requires like such a great amount of human sacrifice that it kind of sets an age limit to how long a human will live. And eventually, after being trapped by this for thousands of years, the humans decide, okay, we need to stop sacrificing to the dragon and we need to kill it with a nuclear missile or something along those lines. And so they kill the dragon. And afterwards, they're like, oh, how long should we live now that we're free of the dragon? And they're like, oh, we should just live forever. And that's a very bad summary of the story, but that's basically how it goes. Yeah, and I mean, that's fair enough. I just really don't think it will be that people will get generically bored of everything the universe has to offer on average at the age of 300 to 350 or 350 to 400. The culture doesn't actually have laws. There are, of course, agreed on forms of behavior, manners, as mentioned above, but nothing that we'd recognize as a legal framework. Not being spoken to, not being invited to parties, finding sarcastic, anonymous articles and stories about you on the information network. These are the normal forms of manner enforcement in the culture. The very worst crime, to use our terminology, is of course murder, defined as the inevitable brain death or total personality loss in the case of an AI. The result, punishment if you will, is the offer of treatment or what is known as a slap drone. All a slap drone does is follow the murderer around for the rest of their lives to make sure they never murder again. There are less severe variations than seem to deal with people who are simply violent. I just included this murderer's art a little bit here because true, soon. Midi says, I doubt that. I think you'd get lazy. I might get lazy, but I'd be lazy for thousands of years. Oh yeah, I mean, maybe we're agreeing actually. Yeah, I think it would be very easy to just put stuff off for like 500 years. I highlighted a bit of murderer's art to suggest that I think this is one of the problems with how he imagines the culture. If that we imagine there's no possible real ambitions that we can have, then when we get to a problem, and you also have the strong prohibition on murder and so on, why wouldn't people engage in murder as kind of this ultimate ambitious art, this grand spectacle, which can't be copied by these advanced AI minds, not because they're incapable of it in a kind of physical sense, but because they wouldn't ever countenance doing it. Megalomaniacs are not unknown in the culture, but they tend to be diverted successfully into highly complicated games. There are entirely orbitals where some of these philosophically crude, obsessive games are played, though most are in virtual reality. Something of a status symbol for the determined megalomaniac is having one's own stone ship. This is considered wasteful by most people and also futile. If the purpose of it having it is to escape the culture completely and say, set one himself as god or emperor on some backward planet, that person might be free to pilot their, obviously non-AI controlled ship, and even approach a planet, but the contact section is equally allowed to follow that person wherever they go and do whatever it thinks appropriate to stop him or her from doing anything injurious or unpleasant to whatever civilization they come to, or attempt to come into contact with. This tends to be frustrating and virtual reality games, up to including utter level involvement, in which the player has to make a real sustained effort to return to the real world, can even forget that it exists entirely, are far more satisfactory. This is an interesting one. Because why does he imagine that the megalomaniac is going to go to this primitive planet to do something terrible to it? As opposed to, it seems to me, the more plausible account that regardless of how kind of terrible this person may seem to people within the culture, the megalomaniac from the culture taking over a planet would be a much better ruler of it than almost anyone else. Okay, maybe the culture, maybe contact would have to intervene with them after, say, 100 years. But it seems in the first 100 years of any megalomaniac from the culture taking over a planet, it would be very clearly beneficial to that planet. They would do so much, they would advance technology there, things would become much better, and blah, blah, blah. But no, things have to be done in a steady and boring and dull manner of contact. He does, Iain Banks is very negative on religion, including kind of resurrection and reincarnation. But I don't know how much that's reflected actually in the culture. The slapdragon thing is one aspect of the culture that I found people really dislike. Like, people don't like the idea of terrible people not being punished seriously. I think that's true. It's not something that bothers me, but I think it's a very, very common feeling that people find it very frustrating when people go unpunished for terrible crimes. But I would say that I do think within the culture of the culture, the slap drone is a really horrible punishment. Unless, again, you're like quite sociopathic. Because everyone would surely know what the slap drone meant. And so the slap drone following you around wouldn't just be you being followed around and stop from doing murder. It would also mean that you'd be basically totally socially prohibited. Out of very few people, no one's going to hang around with the murderer in the society with no murderers. I mean, I think it's reasonable enough, maybe, but I think it's different when you're just a guy. I think a settler colonial project is one thing, but I think a guy just taking over a planet is not the same, because I think inevitably you will fall into that culture and become assimilated by it, but still kind of put more positive aspects into it and progress the society and so on. Oh yeah, sure. Yeah, that's definitely all included within the culture. Someone suggested. I don't mean religions. I mean people who pursue the scientific possibility of dying, coming back, or transforming bodies entirely. Some people, however, refuse this escape route too and leave the culture altogether for civilization system better, where they can operate in a system which gives them the kind of reward they seek. To renounce the culture is to lose access to technology, though, and again, culture supervises the entry of such people in their chosen civilizations at a level which guarantees they aren't starting with too great of an advantage compared to their original habits, and it retains the option of interfering if it sees fit. And this is just, it seems like the culture is deliberately conspiring to keep other cultures not at that level. Like, what does this mean? Pretending someone from coming too many advantages, apart from limiting the technology that they can share with people there. So this is cool. I don't know if one of the people in the novels is clearly this sort of person, but a few of these megalomaniacs are used by the special circumstances section of the contact. Politics in the culture generally consist of referendums on issues. Anyone may propose a ballot on any issue at any time. All citizens have one vote. Where issues concern some subdivision of a total habitat, all those, human and machine, who may reasonably claim to be affected by the outcome of the poll may cast a vote. Opinions are expressed and positions on issues outlined mostly via the information network, freely available naturally. And here is that any individual may exercise the most personal influence. Given that the decisions reached as a result of these votes are usually implemented and monitored through a hub of the supervisory machines, with humans acting usually on a rota basis, more as liaison officers than any sort of decision-making executive capacity. One of the few rules the culture adheres to with any exactitude at all is that a person's access to power should be in inverse proportion to their desire for it. The sad fact for aspiring politicos in the culture is that levels of power are extremely widely distributed and very short. I mean, I obviously understand why Banks goes for this, but I think he really does, in saying this sort of thing, exclude that there might be people who want to lead, who want to have power, because they would be good at doing it. And it's not like the culture never needed a Roman dictator. They went to war with a group of religious fanatics. And as they fussed around at the start of the conflict, not being totally dominant, billions of members of the culture died. They were killed. Their habitats were blown up by the Adrians, I think they were called, and they died. And in that circumstance, the fact that these people who have this desire for power and could freely and effectively wield it were excluded from these positions of power makes, again, the culture seem like it has strange priorities. Soon asked a while back about immigration. In general, the culture doesn't actively encourage immigration. It looks too much like a disguised form of colonization. Context-preferred methods are intended to help other civilizations develop their own potential as a whole and are designed to neither leech away their best and brightest nor turn such civilizations into miniaturized versions of the culture. Individual groups and even whole civilizations do become part of the culture on occasions. However, only if there seems to be a particularly good reason for it, and if the context reckons it won't upset any other interesting parties in the locality. So yeah, this is it. I mean, on one hand, it's very much what I was discussing when we discussed immigration a while ago, which is, yes, you need to attend to the fact that if you're in a more kind of economically advanced country, immigration can be a detriment very much to the people that are, well, both nations really, or both entities or states or non-states, whatever you want to call them. But I think that sort of starts to break down when you think of something like the culture, where no, like, you should try to be the totalizing force. If you're right, if you're right and you think you're right and you're endlessly smug and sure of yourself, then why are you so reluctant? Why are you so careful? You know, there's a billion trillion people in the culture suffering and dying, in the galaxy suffering and dying. 25AD says, I mean, I'd argue that no human could be better than a mind at being in a position of power, but this is only a contradiction which exists in the circumstance of there being this human AI divide. It's only because the culture is in a circumstance, obviously this might be freely chosen by their members in some significant way, where there is this separation between minds and most of the beings that live in it, and most of the human minds are highly limited, that you even have these sort of circumstances where we can discuss, like, oh, well, through the minds would be much better. And this, finally, is an essay I found interesting that was written about the culture. It begins with someone trying to get the author to read the culture, and they ask, what is the culture? And their interlocutor replies, it's kind of hard to explain. She said, in Thailand, we have this thing called the dog. You see the dog wherever you go, hanging around by the side of the road, skulking around markets. The thing is, it's not a breed. It's more like the universal dog. You could take any dog of any breed, release it into the streets. Within a couple of generations, it will revert to the dog. That's what the culture is. It's like the evolutionary winner of the contest between all cultures, the ultimate basis of attraction. Banks, by contrast, imagines a future transformed by the evolution of cultures first and foremost, and by technology only secondarily. I half expect voting to be nearly obsolete altogether, more close to a formality or an art form. Clearly, we need to preserve voting and first past the post so that all the people that enjoy election nerdery can still prosper in the culture. But to return to the article, modern science fiction writers often have so little to say about the evolution of culture and society that it's become a standard trope of the genre to imagine a technology advanced future that contains archaic social structures. Such a postulate can be entertaining, to the extent that involves a dramatic rejection of Marx's view that development of the forces of production drive the relations of production. The hand mill gives you society with the feudal lord, the steam mill, society with the industrial capitalist. But in more complementary terms, Marx's claim is that there are functional relationships between technology and social structures, such that you can't combine them in any old way. June at least inhibits a certain exuberance, positing a scenario in which social evolution and technology evolution appear to run in opposite directions. The lazy version of this, which has become warily familiar to followers of the science fiction genre, is to imagine a future that has a thinly veiled version of the Roman Empire. Foundation series does this, and he suggests that Star Trek relentlessly exploited cultural references, classical references, and storylines. And of course, George Lucas's Star Wars features the fall of the Republic in the rise of the Empire. What all these worlds have in common is that they postulate humans in futuristic scenarios confronting political and social challenges that are taken from our distant past. I'd say I don't think the Star Trek example is convincing, but rather kind of Star Trek is more people doing our cultural struggle. The core feature of Banks' universe is that he's imagined a scenario in which technology developments has freed culture from all functional constraints, and thus he imagines a situation in which the culture has become purely mimetic. In order to get itself reproduced, a meme does not necessarily have to produce any benefits for a host. A particularly compelling example that Dawkins gives is that of a chain letter, or a modern email or Twitter equivalent. Even if the content's not particularly compelling, the letter typically provides some halfway plausible story about why you should send a copy to everyone you know. The story needs not be entirely persuasive, of course, but it needs to be plausible enough to persuade a fraction of the population to pass it on to a sufficiently large number of people. That's one we could do. We could discuss memes in their classical sense and whether there's any relationship between memes, as discussed by Richard Dawkins, and the kind of contemporary usage of memes. 25AD says, I think Star Wars Federation is an idealized version of the United States. Yeah, I think that's very much true. Or the European Union, yeah. It seems clear that in the interplanetary competition that develops, the cultures that will emerge will be the most virulent or the most contagious. In other words, the culture will simply be that which is best for reproducing itself by appealing to the sensibilities and tastes of human life forms. This is to say that if we take what has been said, that the culture is completely open to all these possibilities, then the culture that the culture has is just the one that appeals to the most people within the culture and to a lesser degree from people outside of the culture. He discusses that the mercenary guy that was mentioned earlier. The difference for Hauser is that Idrians, for all their flaws, have a certain depth or seriousness that is conspicuously lacking in the culture. Their actions have meaning. To put in philosophical terms, their lives are structured by what Charles Kerr refers to as strong evaluation. Indeed, the inability of the culture to take the war that is fighting seriously, even though billions of people are dying in it, serves as one of the consistent sources of entertainment in all the culture novels, as reflected in ship names, which are generally tongue-in-cheek, such as "What are the civilian applications?" or "Thug class value judgment," or "The torturer class xenophobe," "The abominator class falling outside the normal moral restraints," etc. I also had people, when I did my kind of sci-fi introduction that was based on the culture, I also had the people involved being called names like this. One can see that when a Horser might dislike the culture, on the surface his complaint is that they have surrendered their humanity to machines, but what he really wants is a culture that can serve as a source of deeper meaning, which is one of the things that culture conspicuously fails to provide. On the contrary, it turns everything into a joke. The culture may be irresistible, but for essentially stupid reasons. Recognize not taking yourself seriously as a sign of maturity, which, maybe there's something to that, but it doesn't appeal to me in the same way it didn't appeal to Horser. The idea of contact is also involves a brilliant extrapolation on Banks' part from existing trends in liberal society. The easiest way to explain contact is to say that it operates on exactly the opposite principle of the Star Trek's Federation's Prime Directive. The latter prohibits any interference in the affairs of pre-warp civilizations, which is to say technologically undeveloped worlds. The culture, by contrast, is governed by the opposite principle. It tries to interfere as widely and fulsomely as possible. The primary function of its contract branch is to subtly, or not so subtly, shape the development of all civilizations in order to ensure that the good guys win. Stuart McGill says, something that's never really addressed in Star Trek was that while they don't have scarcity for resources, land specifically on Earth is still scarce. No allocation mechanism was ever explored. I mean, maybe that's why they're colonizing. That's why they're out making a federation in the galaxy in order to kind of dissolve the sort of problem. But what does it mean to say that concept arranges things so the good guys wins? It means that it interferes on the side that shares the same values as the culture. There is more at stake here than just individual freedom. For instance, with development of technology, every society eventually has to decide how to recognize machine intelligence and decide whether AI should be granted full personal and legal moralhood. Jesus Christ. Moralhood. Should be granted full legal and moral personhood. The culture naturally has a view on this question. That's because the culture is run by a benevolent technocracy of intelligent machines. Thus, contact in special circumstances will interfere in order to prevent what they call carbon fascism. Huh. There's an episode of OG Star Trek where Kirk gets in an argument with a human offshoot colony over the US Constitution. Neat. Soon says, if you can't take yourself seriously, how can you take other people seriously? I think that is a kind of discussed in why they ended up at war with the Adrians. I don't think the culture took seriously the idea that the Adrians would ever actually attack them. There are two ways of framing this intervention. From the insider perspective, contact is ensuring that truth and justice prevail, or that the good guys win. From an outsider perspective, what the culture is doing is reproducing itself. It's taking every society that encounters and changing it in order that it turns itself into a copy of the culture. Furthermore, it's not just doing this as a casual pastime. Contact is in its own way embodying the prime directive of the culture. It is the heart and soul of the culture, and for many of its inhabitants, it's raised in Deontry, the only source of meaning. This is interesting because in some ways this author is taking kind of the opposite perspective to mine. The culture is maybe not too interventionist, but certainly has really embedded deeply in it. Interventionism is basically its guiding principle. I think part of the culture's foreign policy is determined by not wanting to piss off the other advanced societies in the galaxy. But you need to go to war. You need to be like Che Guevara. It's better to be annihilated by nuclear fire than try to not spread the universalized socialism. This is what makes the culture the ultimate memeplex, the largest, deepest basin of attraction. It exists only to reproduce itself. It derives its entire sense of purpose from a set of activities that result in it seeking out and converting all society to its own culture. Of course, This is how not the people how the people of the culture perceive it. As far as they're concerned, they're just doing the right thing, and not enough of the right thing, in my view. Self-perception, of course, part of what makes the culture so effective at reproducing itself. In conclusion, he writes, Banks' conception of the culture is driven by three central ideas. First, there is the thought that, in the future, the basic problem of social organization will be given essentially technocratic solutions, and so the competition between cultures will be based on their viral qualities, not their facial attributes. Second, there is a postulation of contact as an essentially the reproductive mechanisms of the culture. And finally, there is a suggestion that the operations of contact serve not just as an idle distraction, but in fact provides a solution to an existential question that is at the core of the culture. This is what gives the culture its ultra-viral quality. Its only reason for existence is to reproduce itself. This is going to be the end of the podcast, which I think is unfortunate because I don't really agree with this as a conclusion, but it is going to be what's on screen as we head out, unless I scroll back up to my own paragraph that I started things out with. Stuart McGill says, that makes sense. Another issue that was that for a while, probably for budget reasons, Starfleet was weirdly dominated by humans. A great deal of the facts about the Star Trek universe can be explained via budgetary reasons. And it's one of the nicest things about books, right? Because TV sci-fi or movie sci-fi is really fundamentally limited by the amount of weird humans you can make. Well, this isn't a problem in any novel, and I think something which is maybe not sufficiently exploited in novels. Soon says, thanks, Stefan. That was really good. Thanks, Soon. I'm glad people think so. I don't know if I'll do this again. It was an experiment. In terms of view numbers, it was almost exactly the same as it would normally be. It was less focused. That isn't necessarily a problem because people kind of jump in and out of these streams. It was longer. I expected that to be the case, and I'm fine with it. Apart from the fact I'm now really thirsty. Since it's a good idea to use essays as a springboard. Yeah, it is definitely. But I think maybe the best route is the middle route, which is what I did for Lord of the Rings at one time, where I used an essay as a basis, but I still made it into a PowerPoint and included my own substantive thoughts. Hadron Thesis said, am I coming at the tail end of this? Yes, I have been speaking for an hour and a half. MIDI wants pictures. I do sometimes think about including pictures. But when you include pictures, also, would we have to, I think we'd have to worry a lot with pictures about copyright stuff. AD says, I think when people complain about this kind of moral and cultural chauvinism, they can be very vague. Because when you get into specifics, because it's hard to defend when you get specific. Yeah, I think that's very true. You're like, oh, don't do this. I mean, everything, all cultures is the same. You're like, oh, well, is this just as good as this? And they're like, no. Our way of doing things is obviously better. But we shouldn't impose it upon others. We should let them do their wrong things and suffer and die and be miserable, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, it's not an idea that I find at all sympathetic. I'm also, it's a very interesting ride. The culture series, much appreciated. Thank you. Let me click on the outro button. What's going on here? I don't know what's going on, but I've lost a chat comment. Like it's kind of in between Soon and Midi's one. So I can read when you actually talk about the something, it's just kind of trapped between two comments. It's in like the nether zone. It's in the back rooms of chat. But I'm going to do the outro and I will say goodbye to you all. Oh wait, I got rid of this for a second. I really do wish there was an option to have myself slightly larger inside the text on screen because there's so much wasted space when it's like this. There's like all this massive bit that just goes entirely to waste. But what can you do?